Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to our second to last populism seminar, but more on that later. Our topic today is how populists react to challenges, and we have two papers, one from Lisa Zehnter and one from Meyer. We're going to start with Lisa, and then Brett is going to come in afterwards. Just a little bit of house rules before I turn it over to the presenters. It's being recorded, so those of you who don't want to be recorded, just so you know. And what we'll do is we'll do both presentations, and then we'll do a Q&A afterwards. And you can type your questions into the into the chat, or you can raise your hand and you can ask it verbally, which is sometimes nice because then we can have some interaction. So without further ado, I think I'll just give all the time to the papers. Lisa, do you want to start us out?
Okay, I hope you all see my screen and can hear me well. Many thanks for giving me the opportunity to present today. My presentation is called "There's No Such Thing as One People, Contextualizing Group References in Populist Political Communication." And I would like to start off with this quote by Jan Werner Müller that self-refers to that article he wrote in 2014, which says, "It has tacitly taken for granted the existence of an actual people as an empirically verifiable number, so to speak. Yet, democratic theory has been struggling with the apparent indeterminacy of the people for some time, to put it mildly." And what Müller says that the democratic theory has some issues with this term, the people, also is true for populist theory. Because if we follow the definition by Karl Mödde in his ideational approach to populism, we know that people-centrism is one of the three defining characteristics, next to anti-elitism and the general will. And theoretically, the people are defined by homogeneity and unity. The people are the in-group and its opposition to other groups. And these are then the outgroups. But there are two challenges. So the first one is there are not so many attempts that have tried to measure people-centrism in political texts. And this goes back to the quote by Müller, not only populist parties use group references or references to the people in their political communication. However, there is some work. For instance, in 2007, Jagers and Walrabe developed a handbook that included the people index. However, manual coding is challenging for large amounts of textual data. Later, Reuden and Pauls developed a dictionary to measure populism, but they, in the end, dropped people-centrism and only measured anti-elitism. Heinrich and Werner made a qualitative analysis of representative claims by the AfD and the FPÖ, but there's the focus on the populist radical right parties and no comparison to non-populist parties. And finally, Strikovic et al. Conducted elite interviews with Dutch MPs and measured their perception of the people, but there is this strong focus on the individual politician's concept of the people. However, what we can learn from these studies is that the composition of the in-group is fluent and adaptable, and this ambiguity can be exploited by political actors. We can learn that there are differences between actors from the same party family, and we can also learn that by referring to the people, political actors display closeness and create a sense of belonging and self-identification with the in-group. Secondly, the strand of literature I'm referring to is more broad on measuring group references, and the three studies quoted here all apply manual coding again, which is time and resource intensive, and they all develop broad coding schemes that are on the go extended, and that means that the group categories that they use are only systematized and reclassified and aggregated into a higher level after the coding is completed. And this need for post-analysis, extension of target words, or what I will in the next slide then call C terms, is challenging for automized approaches such as dictionaries. However, again, substantially, we learn that group appeals have increased both in absolute and relative terms in election manifestos, and the concentration has diminished. So Substantially going back to my research question, we can develop some expectations, namely that reference to the people are context dependent and should differ across party ideology, country, communication channel, and over time. And today I will focus on the first 3 bullet points. But in a nutshell, I expect that there's no single identity of the in-group, but instead that the people have many faces. I talked about lots of challenges, and I thought a great solution would be a dictionary approach, because dictionaries are great, they are fast and reliable, but they depend on a clearly defined concept of interest. And as Tao has summarized it, unlike for policy or issue categories where we have these exhaustive lists, this is not really the case for group categories. And to summarize the shortcomings of dictionaries, the first one is of false positives. So these are terms that are thought to be referring to groups, but might have a second or unintended meaning. And we can make sure to not include this in our analysis when we use the keyword in context function, where we can display the use of these words and see if this is really the intended meaning. And false negatives, this is even trickier, because we only find group references in text that are present in the dictionaries. What we don't have in there, we will never find. And we might overlook possible synonyms. And there the idea was to extend dictionaries with word embeddings. So to answer the question, one solution, does this work? Well, kind of. The exclusion of false positives works quite well, but the search for synonyms and antonyms is rather discouraging. And I always thought I do something wrong or my data is bad, but I've been talking to many colleagues that are also working with word embeddings, and they kind of mirror that expectation that you still need a lot of fine tuning and go deeper into the data. So what now? Instead of just stopping my presentation here, I thought it would be still interesting to compare the context of usual suspects of group references. And there I started with the C terms displayed here. So for the in-group, I used the term for people, population, and citizens, and then also included humans, because this is or mentioned in German, because this is a term that many qualitative studies have also included in their in-group analysis. And I also included we, because this is this perfect example for this attempt to create this self-identification. And for the outgroup, I started with elite, obviously, foreigners, mostly because this is an ascription. You would normally not consider yourself a foreigner or Ausländer, but it's something that you call an outgroup. And then thirdly, I also included Muslims for now. Okay, just quickly for my workflow, I constructed corpora for Austria, Switzerland, and Germany. So this comparative study for the 3 countries that communicate in German language. And I today look at election manifestos and press releases, but I also hope to include social media data or tweets in the future. And I will go through this rather quickly, but if you have any question on that, please just ask them afterwards. So I tokenized and pre-processed the texts. It's important that I did in STEM, because that can change the meaning of words in German rather heavily. And then created a tokenized corpus of the contexts around these words, and this context is really important with word embeddings. And then created document feature metrics and document embedding metrics. Again, I'm happy to talk about that later. And then we can actually calculate embeddings for each party. So we can group the data by the variables that are in our data set. And because I'm interested in parties, I did that by party. And then we can compare the nearest neighbors, so the words that have the highest cosine similarity of our terms of interest and are most similar or are nearest. And finally, we can also calculate a nearest neighbor's cosine similarity ratio. Just to give you a first impression, these are the descriptives for how often the C terms appeared in my data set, and this is for press releases. So what we actually can see that elites or Muslims are never mentioned in Swiss press releases, and that the term we heavily dominates German press releases. And if we look at manifestos, again, no Muslims in Swiss manifestos, no elites in Austrians, and also reference to the people, like literal ones, appear only very seldom, both in Austria and in Germany, a bit more in Switzerland. Okay, but then let's have a first look at the nearest neighbors, and I highlighted some maybe important terms. I'm sorry that the slides are in German, but as I'm working with a German language model, I thought it's best to display it in German, and I will highlight a few of them in English. So what you, for instance, can see is that the left party talks about sovereignty and self-determination of the people. Also, the AfD talks about sovereignty. When it's about population, so Bevölkerung, it's about acceptance for almost for a lot of the party, and a lot about protection and support. And the AfD discusses the term population in a context of being in danger. Yes, and this is right now referring to press releases, and also for citizens. For instance, the AfD uses terms such as duty or state of law in the context of citizens. Whereas for humans, it's a lot about participation, social, and the Greens and the left also mention poverty. And again, for the AfD, humans are depicted of needing protection and being vulnerable. I also wanted to show you some outgroup terms, and I think this is probably one of the slides with highest face validity, so to say, because I mean, we see that the left never uses the term Ausländer, foreigner, and that also shows that I might have, or I will have to include different terms to capture outgroups, whereas the AfD discusses foreigners in context of criminality, underage, being unaccompanied, and crimes, whereas other parties rather talk about integration, minorities, right of residence, and citizenship, even for the FDP. With regard to the other outgroups, for elites, I think like maybe this Rettungspolitik needs some explanation. This is a reference to the policies concerning the rescue of the euro, especially with regard to Greece. So that kind of comes from the founding time of the AfD, and also this violated is in this context because they said that this violates actually the law. And the other parties rather talk about resources, economics, finances. And for the left, they mention the term Großkonzerne, which means major corporations. And this is a typical left-wing populist, anti-elitist term, so to say. And then finally, regarding Muslims, we see that, for instance, the Social Democrats mention minorities. Not surprising that the CDU-CSU mentions Christians. And for the Greens, you can see that they talk about stuff such as discrimination, racism, minorities, or anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, the findings for the AfD are a bit boring because I had to include all the different German cases. So nominative, accusative, dative, and so forth. This is why this is not so interesting. Okay, and then another glimpse at what you can do with word embeddings. Here I present the nearest neighbors cosine similarity ratio. And I think many of you have not seen such a plot yet. So I will try to describe it as good as possible. So firstly, what you see here, like values that are bigger than 1 on the right side are discriminant of the Populist party, because I put the Populist party into the numerator of this calculation. And values that are smaller than 1 are discriminant of the other parties. And for now, I put always the Populist party into the numerator and all other parties into the denominator. And such a star here shows that the results are significant because you can do permutation and bootstrapping. And this is not an asterisk as in classical text analysis. So this is really only Demokratie and not also Demokratien or something like that. And what you see here is that for the SVP in Switzerland, concerning context words of the people in manifestos, and they talk about saving or preserving and about enforcing and clear. However, these results are not significant when you permutate. But what is significant is that other parties discuss the term the people in a context of democracy or say something like empowerment. And this is also probably interesting that dienen, so serving, is also significant. Okay, and then just to also show you something for Austria, for the elites in Austrian press releases. Again, everything larger than one is concerning the FPÖ. And here you find terms such as propagate, Linke, which means left. So they talk about left elites, and also bourgeois elites. Whereas other parties discuss elites rather in terms of wealth. So terms such as Vermögenden, this is not Ögenden, but Vermögenden, so rich or wealthy. Yeah, and this is they develop a rather economic or financial concept of elites. Okay, the next steps that I want to do, and also some questions for you. I'm still thinking if there are certainly other C terms that I should include in the analysis, especially for the outgroups. And I wanted to ask you if you have an idea what could be a usual suspect for a left-wing populist outgroup, and also for this calculation of the nearest neighbors sign similarity ratio. Right now, as I said, I always compare the populist party to all other parties, but I'm sure like there are many options how I could do that, and I wanted to ask you guys what you find most plausible or have any ideas on that. And rather technically, I'm thinking about also using different locally trained embeddings, because right now they are trained on German newspaper data and accordingly have a focus on Germany, because Austrian and Swiss politics isn't covered as much as German politics there. And it's also possible to not only compare nearest neighbors, but nearest context. So you don't have only individual words, but actually have half sentences or so. I hope I'm not over time. This is it. Thank you very much. And in case of questions, you can reach me via mail and Twitter. Thank you.
Many thanks for your presentation. You're perfectly in time, no worries at all. So I will hand over to Brett right away, and then we have our discussion all together. So Brett, the floor is yours.
Okay, give me a second here. Now let me turn my screen on also. Start video. There we go. Okay, so yeah, let's from beginning. Okay, so thank you for inviting me to give this presentation. Now this is not a typical academic presentation. What this is a compilation of several pieces of research I've done on populist leaders during COVID. And so I'm going to address a variety of things here. One, how populist leaders responded to COVID during the early months of it. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how populist-led countries actually fared with COVID cases and deaths, and then talk a little bit about how this has affected their poll numbers. So this is bringing a variety of things together. And then at the end, I'm going to discuss a bit how, basically how populist leaders have fared in the wake of COVID, and how opposition parties have gathered together to try to remove them from office. Okay, so here's a plot of data that I work for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. It's a think tank, and we have a data set on populist leaders in power around the world. And one of the things that you see here is actually the biggest decline in populist leaders around the world since we put together our data set in 1990 has been in the last few years, so during COVID. And if you remember back to the beginning of COVID in like April 2020, the early reactions were that the populist revolution is going to become a victim of COVID, right? COVID could kill off populism because these are leaders who are, they're anti-expert. Politics for them is more about show than substance. Traditionally have little concern for health policy. If you look at their manifestos, you're not going to see much about health policy. And it's not that necessarily populists do bad in crisis. I mean, a lot of them come to power in crises, but this was the wrong type of crisis for populist leaders. And so this view, which you could find in some newspaper op-eds, I think was what a lot of people were thinking about at the beginning of COVID, as far as how it would affect populist leaders. This is going to be a problem for them, and maybe it won't eliminate populism, but it's going to reduce the, if you will, populist threat. Well, this is just something that I wanted to examine, right? Being, having a social science background, it's like, okay, we can investigate this this claim, and in fact, my data set. We only identify, I think it was 18 or 19 populist leaders in power around the world at the beginning of COVID. So what I basically just did is I researched how they had all responded. And I found that actually this idea that populist leaders are all going to downplay COVID, I found that that wasn't true. I found that only 5 of 18 populist leaders in power downplayed COVID, at least during its early months. So I wrote this report it was published in August 2020, and I found that the majority of populists took COVID pretty seriously. But even among the 13 that I identified who took it pretty seriously, there was variation in how they responded, in the sense of how strict or how illiberal, as I call it, their responses were to COVID. So I found that 5 of these 13 who took it seriously also had pretty illiberal responses. So including things like, very punishing lockdowns in India. If you remember back to those early months, I think even within the first few weeks of COVID, there was a total lockdown in India, which prevented people from moving around the country, which was a problem because India has a lot of internal migration for work, so people couldn't get home. And even though at this time, this was the policy, even though India didn't have many COVID cases. So there were a variety of responses from populist leaders, but most took it seriously. And so what I found was a bit different than what people thought at first. So here's just my list of this. And again, this is in the early months of COVID. So these may have changed over time, but in the beginning, I mean, there were some surprising ones, perhaps. I didn't find much on, even in like Venezuela, on the government using this as an opportunity to crack down, on the opposition, whereas you did find that in places like Turkey or India. Right. So I also investigated this in another piece for European populist parties. And this is probably something with which a lot of you are familiar. How did the populists in Europe respond to COVID? Well, if you remember back to the very beginning, it was kind of the opposite of this general story about populists downplaying COVID. You found like Marine Le Pen and Geert Wilders cracked down on their governments for not doing enough in the first weeks of COVID. And I think, I mean, in both of their cases, they used it played very well into their sort of running story about, what's wrong with politics and what I would do if I were in power, right? Marine Le Pen is like, see, this is what happens when we have open borders. This is what happens when we outsource our manufacturing capacity. Then we don't have enough PPE. Then we have people bringing COVID into the country. So they pretty seamlessly fit this into their ongoing narratives. Whereas, of course, other populists like Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro had a more difficult time figuring out what to do. There's been some other research that also showed that populist leaders in Europe implemented really similar policies as non-populist. So these are, leaders in Eastern Europe at the time. But again, I found that there were differences really. And then I have another piece where I basically where I looked at this for the whole world sample for, in 2021, when we finally have data on, the policies that different types of leaders implemented. So yes, the populist leaders in Europe took it seriously in the beginning, but I found for the global sample, through summer of 2021, I found differences in policy stringency and illiberalness. So again, just like I found for the early months of COVID. So this is a world sample, and I use the Oxford CGRT index, which some of you may be familiar with, and also the VDEM pandemic democratic violations. And I found, so on what we see here on the y-axis, I coded populist by the different types that I identified from my first report. So those who downplayed it, those who took it seriously but were illiberal, those who were serious but liberal, and then just pooling them all together. And I found that in terms of, there's some interesting differences in terms of policy stringency, and this is again through summer of 2021, so probably 15 months into the pandemic. Those who downplayed it in the beginning continued to have less stringent policies throughout, whereas those who were serious but illiberal had more stringent policies. This is why I find a null effect for populists, because they go in different directions, which is very interesting to me. However, they don't really go in different directions for democratic violations. At least 2 of the 3 types had, more democratic violations than other types of leaders. So again, I mean, what I find here is consistent with what I found in the first place, which is that populists responded to the pandemic in different ways. Okay, how did their responses evolve over time? So, I mean, as you know, the pandemic didn't strike everywhere around the world at the exact same time. The first wave was mostly in Western Europe and the Americas, and this created a bit of a false sense of security among populist leaders in other places, right? So in Eastern Europe, they didn't really have the first wave of the pandemic. Certainly in South Asia, they didn't get the first wave of the pandemic, and in a lot of these places, they started to relax their policies, which were often quite strict in the beginning, even though they didn't have a lot of cases. But so, not having had a lot of cases, they started to relax their policies. And that's when there was a problem, right? Because the second wave, the fall 2020 wave, hit Eastern Europe very hard. And then you ended up with some of the highest case and death rates in the world there. The third wave in winter and spring of 2021, this hit South and East Asia very hard. I mean, especially in India. So I went into the case of India a bit in one of these reports that I wrote. Modi took a lot of heat for relaxing restrictions on religious gatherings. So this Hindu festival called the Kumbh Mela, which ended up becoming a super spreader event. And he allowed political rallies among his supporters after having cracked down on earlier gatherings among Muslims during the first wave of the pandemic that didn't actually strike India. So it was a bit of, inconsistent behavior over time, although you could say, well, in the beginning, no one knew what was going on. Now, they hadn't had cases, so, well, you should be a little bit more relaxed. Well, it kind of looks like they were a bit selectively relaxed about the enforcement of these policies that they had. So what did this mean as far as total cases and deaths? What did populist performance in the pandemic look like compared to non-populist leaders? Well, I actually found, and this was to my surprise, it was interesting. I started this piece, I went on Fareed Zakaria on CNN, which is a international news program here in the United States. I went on his show to talk about populist leaders in the pandemic about a year ago. And the other guy who was on the program with me is this guy, Yasha Monk, who incidentally used to be my boss. And he was claiming that populists had done worse in the pandemic, that you saw that they had high case and death rates higher than non-populist leaders. So this idea from the beginning that populists would do worse with the pandemic, he said, this has proven to be true. And I wasn't so sure about that. I didn't say this, but in the back of my head, I'm like, yeah, I'm not sure that that's true. So I collected the data and tested it. Turns out he was right. Populists did have more cases and deaths. And again, this is through June 2021. These well, if you will, correlations are not always significant, but they tend in a direction, right? So again, the ones who downplayed it earlier, in a lot of the regressions, they had, higher case and death rates. And same for those, interestingly enough, who were serious but illiberal. And the interesting thing about that is, of course, if you remember from a few slides back, I also found that the serious illiberal populists, so these 5 guys, had more stringent policies. So they, took the pandemic more according to the Oxford CGRT index than other types of leaders. So that's interesting because they took it more seriously. You'd expect that they would have had, fewer cases and deaths, yet they still had more. So that was kind of an interesting puzzle. Okay, so how does this all matter for populists? Now we're a few years on where the pandemic has come and gone multiple times. What has this meant for populist leaders relative to non-populist leaders? So I've done a few pieces on this. I did a blog post on our website back in 2020, and I found that I found a few things. So I looked at a few things here. I looked at not just populist parties, but the main government party, how they pulled other parties in government, and then non-populist opposition parties. And what I found is basically at the beginning of COVID, we saw that parties were getting, the leaders were getting this bump from COVID. And I wanted to see whether that was just the leaders party or whether that was all parties in government. Turns out it was just the leaders party. So it was just Angela Merkel. It wasn't Angela Merkel and the SPD. Again, this was a bit surprising to me. I thought going in that it was going to be all mainstream parties that benefited from COVID and polling and just the populists that lost. Well, the populists did lose the most in the beginning, although not a ton, but it was only the main governing party that got a polling boost from COVID. So that was a little bit different than I was expecting, although perhaps not so surprising. You think of like a rally around the flag effect. Well, that's usually just for the leader, not for anyone who's associated with the leader. And then I investigated this again. In fact, my most recent piece on populism and COVID, which just came out in January, I did a blog for the LSE on this. So in longer view, what's happened? Well, Trump struggled with the pandemic and he lost, further support among white college educated voters. And I mean, it's pretty clear that white voters were decisive for Trump. I mean, he lost a lot of them. He lost a lot that he had in 2016, and that's why he lost the election. Bolsonaro appears likely to lose to Lula. We can talk about that again in a minute. But again, most populists took COVID seriously. So did they lose support too? So I only examined this in Europe because you only have really good polling data in Europe on all parties. So I found that actually COVID hurt populist polling and that non-populists fared better, like right in the beginning of COVID and when there were death spikes. So here's a bit of a complicated looking graph from my piece. The top panel is the most interesting one here. So the red line is polling for non-populist governments. So these are all parties in government, by the way. So this pools two groups I had separate before, which is the leading party in government and the coalition parties. But still, you find that when COVID hits, they had been polling, the populist-led governments had been polling behind the non-populist-led ones. That switches immediately when COVID happens, and that lasts for another about 18 months. And the next two panels here are average deaths in red, and then the polling for first populist-led governments and then non-populist-led governments, both in blue. And yeah, you see the non-populist-led governments, they get a polling spike when you get this first death spike, and then they kind of maintain at this high level, again, not really affected by the second COVID spike. Whereas the populist-led government's first death spike happens, the polling starts to go down. I wouldn't say there was a sharp response here, but I mean, clearly the trend is down over the next, I don't know, 14 or so months. So, and again, this is just for Europe, but it does appear that the populist-led governments, their polling response, it was the opposite of the non-populist-led governments, both when COVID happened and then also perhaps in response to these death spikes. Okay, so what do we take from all of this? Got a few more minutes. COVID and consequences for populism. So this is definitely, this is a thesis that my boss, Tony Blair, likes, that there's a flight to seriousness during events like pandemics. So I had to write this up a bit extra in my report at the beginning of the year. even if populists take it seriously, people may be more likely to become tired of such types of politicians. I mean, the shtick wears old, right? When you have a very serious event going on and these guys are giving these ridiculous press conferences like we had with Trump, people get kind of tired with that, and where they're like, okay, I'll just vote for the other guy. I'm a bit skeptical about there being much future effect here. It seems like the pandemic really is wearing down, even though some people don't seem to think that. And perhaps if mainstream politicians push excessive lockdowns, then we get a bit of a backlash again. We saw this with the Canadian truckers a few months back. So populists, of course, could benefit from the turmoil of a hard economic landing if there's interest rate increases like are happening right now. But this is not really an effect of the pandemic, right? And the research on populists and crises shows that they benefit more from financial and banking crises than general economic crises. So we might get to put this this theory to the test again in the next few years. How about removing populist leaders? This is perhaps the more interesting thing to discuss. So several of these guys have been in power a long time, and again, guys get sick of them. People get sick of them. I was a bit surprised the Hungarians aren't quite sick of Orban yet. He won that election pretty convincingly. But how's the opposition taken on these populist leaders who have been in power for so long? And one of the things that I found, I wrote a lot about this in my report at the beginning of the year. In a lot of these countries with these populist leaders who have been in power a long time, you find the opposition is forging a coalition, a pre-electoral coalition that really just focuses on removing the populists. This is what happened in Israel. I mean, you have this incredibly ideologically diverse coalition in Israel right now. They really can't agree on anything. The only thing that they can agree on is to remove Netanyahu from power. And they're really unified by the fear that if they failed, Netanyahu returns, and it looks like that would happen. So they've been able to stick to the straight and narrow. They were able to use this strategy to get Netanyahu out of power, and they're really focused on things that they can agree on, the small set of things that they can agree on, which include institutional changes like term limits to prevent popular re-entrenchment and other less controversial policies. So I think this is sort of my advice to movements that want to remove populists, is that you have to really focus on the things you can agree on. Your movement is going to be ideologically diverse. You have to have that in order to remove populists. Often the populist-led party still gets a plurality of support, even after 10 or 15 years in power. So you have to really have minimalist designs on what you're going to do with power. Then just a little bit about the elections this year and what you might expect. Well, actually, populists have been doing pretty well so far, right? So Vučić won easily in Serbia. I mean, I was amazed. I thought Orban was going to win because he was always ahead in the polling. But he won by a huge margin. I think everyone was really surprised by that. I mean, it's so big that I don't think it was like, Putin winning all those years. There might have been electoral fraud, but the win wasn't just because of electoral fraud, I don't think. Orban has been popular throughout. And I mean, it was amazing that he was able to turn the Russian invasion, which should have been a negative for him because he's been pro-Russia. He was able to turn that into a positive. So, I mean, he's not past his expiration date in Hungary, I think, to a lot of people's surprise. Janez Janša lost in Slovenia. That was a bit surprising. And that's also an interesting case because it isn't one of these cases of the opposition unifying to remove him. It's this guy Golub, he was a known guy in Slovenian politics, but he came out of nowhere, formed his own party, and that all of a sudden they just became overwhelmingly popular and won the election. The opposition had been trying to do this coalition forging thing like in Hungary or in Israel, but it didn't work. I mean, people don't like the opposition parties in Slovenia either, but Golub made a party, came out of nowhere, won. Duterte can't run for re-election, so it doesn't look like there's going to be a populist running in the Philippines. Bolsonaro is not popular and has been polling behind Lula, who he's probably going to be running against. But he's seen a bit of an uptick in the polling recently, so we'll see. Who knows what will happen in Brazil? So there's that. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Let me figure out if I can, turn my screen sharing off.
Excellent. Many thanks. If you've been able to, or I can switch it off actually as well. Okay, well, thanks a lot for those two presentations and the insights in your research. So, to those in the audience, you can either use the Q&A function, or you can raise your hand and we can open your mic, or you can also use the chat to pose your questions for Lisa and Brad. If there are no questions from the audience at this point in time, maybe Annika or Andre, do you have a question? Annika, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Lisa and Brett for your presentations. And I do have a few questions and sort of thoughts for both presentations. So I'll just sort of start with Lisa. I think it's a really great project to take the quantitative text analysis and dig deeper into how populists actually define the people, because I think there is we have sort of a sense around, that should be very context dependent and all of these sort of things, but we're not really sure how context dependent it is, and I really like that all the other parties are in there as well. So I had a few thoughts. I mean, one of the things is, you sort of set out with this, the goal of finding out who the people are, but then it doesn't like what the results, they're sort of more, how do the parties characterize them in a way, and it's not really who are the people. And maybe my question sort of comes from that study that I did, where we try to figure out what are the groups within it. And I wonder whether your kind of method can also dig more into, whether certain groups like, I don't know, white people, Christians, women, workers, whether it's that, or whether they're any kind of, whether you sort of get closer to the descriptors of who the people are. And with that, I think there might also be an interesting comparison to the other parties, because I mean, for instance, I could imagine, or from the theory, the party theory, we would think that green parties should have kind of the opposites, coming from multiculturalism. And I wonder whether that then means that they also kind of describe the people differently, or whether they not describe the people at all, because it's something different, more like an audience. And I was wondering sort of around what that we actually means. Is that we the people, we the party, we some sort of a social group? And then I had an idea, because so when we talk about especially the radical right parties, we often have this kind of, or there's a bit of literature looking at, well, sometimes they talk about nativism, and sometimes it's more sort of specific nationalism, more around what does it mean to be like a German citizen versus a German culturally. And I wonder whether you can, with the method that you have, whether you can kind of get further at the balance between those two, and whether they actually, whether there's something that could be contributed. And Brett, I actually have a few sort of quite sort of quick, more kind of informational questions, because you have a lot of studies that you've presented there, and you start out with the populists, and you showed very briefly who the populists are in your studies, but then in your models you have sort of the effect of being a populist, which makes me think that you must have some non-populists in your data set. And I wonder whether you can just tell us a bit more of who that kind of reference group is, because that might tell us a little bit also about where your effects come from. another sort of aspect is you had this analysis on the death rates, like whether populists kind of cause more cases and more death rates, but it seemed to be that those are absolute numbers. And just because, I mean, you have India in your populism camp, so have you controlled for country size and population size there? And I'll just leave it there. I have some more questions, but I think for understanding, it would be really good to get those two questions out.
Lisa, do you want to go first and briefly responding, and then Brad, and then we have actually a question from the audience.
Sure. Many thanks, Annika. And you're absolutely right. So my idea, I mean, I really liked your article, and that was kind of an inspiration also to do that in a quantitative manner. And I hoped to find synonyms and groups and adjectives, you know, saying like German people or whatever, kind of defining the identity more clearly, but that didn't work. So like, unfortunately, I mainly get nouns that do not refer to groups. But so what is also possible is that I could compare the similarity between, for instance, how the AFD describes the people and how the AFD describes, for instance, I don't know, workers. And then I could compare these similarity measures, and then I can show, I don't know, I haven't done it yet, but I imagine that I can show that there are differences in how these terms are connected, because apparently they are not nearest neighbors, but it might still tell us something about where in the really high dimensional space these are two located. So that's a really good idea. Thank you for bringing me to that. And I swallowed the we. I'm sorry, I forgot about that, because with we it didn't really work. Well, it did not work, but all I got was verbs. And so it always showed me nearest neighbors saying like, we demand, we want to improve, or stuff like that. And there I could only find a kind of a distinction between government and opposition parties, because you could really see that government parties talk about implementing and doing something, and opposition parties demand something. But as this is a complete different research question and paper, I kind of have to drop that, but I have to tell everybody that I drop it. And with regard to this dimension, nativism versus civic nationalism, that's a really smart idea, and I have to think about how I can include such a scale in there. Many thanks.
May I hand over to you for a quick response?
Yeah, so I had to go back and look at my regressions to see what I had included in there. There is a control for population. There's also a control for region, and the regions are fairly tightly defined. And the reason I put that in there, of course, is because, you know, a virus travels to the nearest area, so that captures things like Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Asia. So yeah, that's all in there, and the sample is a global sample. So I think, yeah, sometimes when I do these analysis, I only include countries that are democracies, but I think this was a global sample, so including autocracies and democracies. So it's comparing populists and these, you know, categories of populists to all leaders. So yeah, that's the comparison there.
Thanks. I invited Sophia to open her microphone, so she should be able to pose a question.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for your presentations. They were really interesting. And I have a question for Lisa. So you look at 3 outgroups that help you to define who the people are according to the political parties under analysis. And they are the elites, so you have the quintessential populist outgroup, and foreigners and Muslims, that they are more culturally or ethnically defined. And I was wondering if you had already some data, you were planning also to look at other outgroups in addition to this. So I was thinking, for instance, that, you know, international organizations, multinationals, the European Union, so more economic than culturally defined outgroups. Because as Annika said, for the definition of the people, I think there may be interesting party families differences there. Thank you very much.
Do you want to briefly respond, Lisa? And then I have a question that's for Brett.
Yes, thanks, Sophia, for that great question. Yes, so I see that right now I have a heavy bias towards the right with foreigners and Muslims, and the idea to include this kind of a more concretely defined economic elites, which would also be expected by rather left-wing populist parties, is a really good idea. The problem is, like, the list of these terms that I could look at is kind of endless. And with terms such as European Union or the shortened EU, this is going to be really hard, because they don't always refer to the EU as a group, so to say, but also rather as an institution. And of course, that can also be a foe in a populist view. But I could imagine that it's a lot about laws, and it's really hard to do that on a quantitative level, where you have to make sure, and this is this thing with false positives, that you might capture a lot of noise when you include terms such as EU. But what I found when looking at elites with the left wing, I had this Großkonzerne, these major corporations, and that was actually finally a synonym for kind of an elite from a left wing perspective. And I think I have to, like, dig deeper there. But then again, I'm not so sure if Großkonzerne or major corporations is a word that is used so often. So I want to, like, dig deeper in what the left parties did, and hopefully find something that captures this dimension, and not only not like the vertical one better than it does right now only with elites. But many thanks for bringing this up.
Perfect. So there is a question in the chat for Brett from Paul, or actually a few questions. I would add a third one. So Paul asks, well, how did you select your cases of populist parties in power? Could you tell us a bit more about the rationale there, and whether they're all really purely populist? And second, what about those populist parties that were not in power? Did you consider them? To what extent, or why was this beyond your analysis? And let me add a third point to this, which I found really interesting. I really like this way of categorizing populist parties in illiberal and etc. I was wondering a bit, to what extent is thick ideology driving them, right? I mean, at least for me, but maybe this is because I don't have the case selection in mind. With illiberal populists, there are 2 or 3 cases that pop to my mind, and I wonder whether this is more a reflection of them being far right potentially. Could you tell us a bit about that as well?
Let me start with this last point. So that liberal illiberal downplay is just based on their behavior in the first months of the pandemic. That isn't some general statement about categorization of populist leaders. Having said that, the data are our institute's data that I and colleagues have coded, and I mean the data set has existed now for a few years. And you can go back and read our old reports on how we coded the data if you're interested in that. We do actually have, we do break down populists into some substantive categories, which I think is really important. And it's something that, I mean, this keeps coming up. I mean, I get these papers to review on, like, populists and central bank independence, and there's like no ideological differences between the populists. And I'm like, but you know, these guys in South America were, you know, like elected to, you know, bring these neoliberal reforms. And then you have guys like Chavez on the other hand. Yeah, so in our data, we have this breakdown into 3 categories. We have these socioeconomic, or if you will, left-wing populists, cultural populists, which are like most of the right-wing populists in Europe, the ones who care about immigration and religion and this kind of stuff. And then we have a third category, anti-establishment, which that was more because we couldn't think of a better name for it. But this is really the guys like these neoliberal reformers, guys who focus more on crime, but not so much on culture. It has also captured a lot of the Eastern European populists who, you know, came to power, like the 5 Star Movement is a good example. They're not really they're not strongly ideological, but they are populist in the sense that they want to, you know, bring down the old regime. Right, so I didn't use the categories from our data so much in any of this work. so how I selected the cases. I mean, the sample, like I said before, is a global sample. I think it's all countries, or most countries at least. So yeah, am I missing a question in there, or is that it?
I mean, the question was a bit like, how did so for example, the Austrian Freedom Party, okay, it wasn't in government in the pandemic, but it was before. Is a junior partner considered part of the government, or are you only talking about head of government as a unit of analysis to code this?
Yeah, so I mean, this is like 7 different projects or 6 different projects, and almost all of them are with our populist leader data. So those wouldn't include like anything about other populist parties, or even if there was a populist party in the coalition, but the leader was non-populist, or vice versa. So like, I don't know, if a country is a leader and there's also a non-populist party in government, we code it as having a populist leader. The same thing, if it's a non-populist leader, but there's a populist party also in government, then we code it as non-populist. But I mean, some of the stuff that I focused on Europe, that the polling from the first few months in Europe, that broke this down a bit. So I was looking at the populist parties that weren't in government, and also this report that I wrote on how populist parties not in government responded to COVID. But most of the stuff that I just showed you is on populist leaders.
Thank you very much for the clarification. Are there any further questions from the audience? Andre, do you have questions?
No, I don't. No, I don't.
Okay, okay, no worries.
Shall we? Yeah.
Yeah, let me.
Do you want me to share the screen, or do you want to? I have the slide.
Yeah. So
can you see it this time? Apparently, last time you couldn't see my slide. Sorry. Can you see it this time?
No, we see the PowerPoint window.
You see the PowerPoint or not?
But not the, yeah. So we see the last slide in the.
You see the last slide. Okay, that's what I want. You see the last slide. You see the last slide? Okay, good. Okay, cool. Should I round? Okay, thank you very much for two very interesting presentations, 2 very interesting papers. Allow me to give some advertisement for the next session. So the next session is coming up May 23rd. It's a later time. Please note that. Because, well, sorry today to Brett, we didn't realize you were coming from the States, but we adjusted our time. But it's a roundtable, and it's on anti-populism and how we should react to populism. And that'll be our last session of the year. Did Annika or Robert, did you want to add anything?
Thanks a lot for the presentation and the interesting insights. And thanks for the questions to the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.